Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're joining me on an amazing adventure to learn about milestones in the history of Canadian education. Here are some of the things we are going to cover today. We will look at the 1816 Common Schools Act, the 1850 Common Schools Act, the 1867 Section 93 BNA Act, the 1871 Common Schools Act, the 1982 Constitution Act, and the 2012 Ontario Education Act. Here are the milestones in the history of Canadian education. Let's begin! The 1816 Common School Act was the first of a series that established common schools in Canada. Grammar schools were already established, but they were only accessible to higher class citizens and their courses weren't meeting public needs. Sir Francis Gore, who was Lieutenant Governor at the time, decided that a school system accessible to lower class citizens was needed, and in 1816, an act to make that possible was created. There were 10 separate districts at the time, and the bill allowed each district to have a board of education that would be in charge of the district's courses, textbooks, and school rules. The higher teachers in each board needed to be British subjects or have taken the oath of allegiance. Each district received a certain amount of money. If more funds were needed, the district would have to charge fees. The schools were cautious of American influences by teachers or textbooks because they wanted to create loyal Canadian citizens. So in 1816, common schools were established. Let's take a look at 1850. The Common School Act of 1850 built on the previous Act of 1816. The purpose of the act was to make provisions for the betterment of common schools. However, all of what resulted from the 1850 Act wasn't necessarily better. Let's see why. It is clearly stated that books in the schools must be examined for approval before being used in schools. In the Act, it states that no child is required to read, study, or do anything religious if the child's parents object to it. Although these factors don't seem to be harmful or questionable, there were clauses for separation that were. It also states that separate schools may be established for Protestants and Roman Catholics in any locality. The district board could authorize schools for solely males or females. The Ontario Common Schools Act in 1851 led to further segregation, especially within the creation of schools solely for Black people. Parents fought for inclusion through writing and petitions. In 1867, the British North American Act, or the BNA, was passed, which gave provinces power over their education. However, there were significant restrictions because the government wanted to protect religious rights, such as those of Catholic and Protestant faith. In 1871, the Common Schools Act aimed to eliminate church-run schooling in New Brunswick and replace it with mandatory attendance to common schools. There were questions about the quality of education received at religious schools because there was no standardization. Teachers could choose to teach whatever they felt appropriate, even though most had no formal teaching credentials. Attendance was low, as only teachers and parents enforced it. Egerton Ryerson, who became Chief and Superintendent of Education for Upper Canada, was fighting to keep power out of the hands of the church and was therefore fighting for secularized schooling. Upon passing the bill, New Brunswick teachers were allowed to open and close school with a Bible reading, but they weren't allowed to perform religious teachings, wear religious clothing, or display religious symbols. The Board of Education took over the curriculum and textbook content. The imposed act caused clashes between the government and Catholic Church, which actually led to a shooting of 2 people following riots in 1875. So what resulted from all of this? A joint religious secular education system. But what about religions other than Catholic and Protestant? Up until the Constitution Act of 1982, Canada had to get approval from Britain anytime they wanted to make legal changes. The 1982 Constitution Act gave Canada independence. The government also created the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Charter gave Canadians the right for French or English minorities to receive an education in their own language. However, it was only if the population was large enough. But what about the people who speak other languages? So far, we've seen lots of ways that people were excluded from education in various forms of segregation. In the beginning, education wasn't available to those in lower classes. This changed when common schools were opened. However, we also saw segregation in terms of gender. Some schools were created just for males, so females were excluded until later years or when their attendance numbers were needed to keep the schools running. There was also segregation based on race, as some schools wouldn't allow Black children to attend. Religion created lots of controversy as people fought for religious schools. The Ontario Education Act of 2012, also called the Accepting Schools Act, stated that all students should feel safe and deserve a positive schools climate that is inclusive and accepting regardless of race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, age, marital status, family status, or disability. We are on the road to a more inclusive education system. Wow, we've come a long way in history and in our learning today. Thank you so much for joining me on this learning adventure. I hope you learned a lot. Until next time.